Nora Grayson tightened her apron and sighed as she wiped down the cafe's counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning. It was the height of tourist season in Cape Haven, a small coastal town known for its breathtaking cliffs and charming boardwalk. That meant an endless stream of out-of-towners, all eager for a cozy coffee shop experience before heading to the beach. "Table 3 wants an extra shot of espresso," her coworker Lily called over. "Got it," Nora replied, moving swiftly to the espresso machine. She was used to the rush, used to the tourists who came and went, leaving nothing behind but empty cups and fleeting smiles. She never got attached. The bell above the door jingled, signaling another visitor. She barely glanced up. Another tourist, most likely, looking for a quick caffeine fix before heading off to explore the cliffs. "Excuse me," a deep voice said, pulling her attention. Nora turned, and for a second, she forgot how to breathe. The man standing in front of her was tall, with dark brown hair that was effortlessly tousled, like he had just stepped off a yacht. He wore a fitted white button-up with the sleeves rolled up, exposing strong forearms, and he had a quiet confidence about him that set him apart from the usual tourists. His piercing blue eyes studied the menu with a thoughtful expression before flicking to her. "What do you recommend?" he asked. Nora snapped out of her daze. "Depends, do you like something strong or sweet?" His lips twitched into a small smile. "Strong, always." "Then you'll want the black roast," she said, grabbing a cup. "It's bold, smooth, and doesn't need anything extra." "Sounds perfect." "I'll take one," he said, then added, "and your favorite pastry, whatever that is." She arched an eyebrow. "You trust a stranger's taste in pastries." He leaned on the counter slightly, closer than necessary. "I have a feeling you have good taste." Nora shook her head with a small laugh, grabbing a fresh kvass and setting it on a plate. "All right, mystery man, that'll be $5 even." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, but before he handed over the cash, he hesitated. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Tourists didn't usually ask for her name, but something about him made her pause. "Nora," she said. He nodded, handing her a crisp bill. "I'm Preston." "Nice to meet you, Nora." She handed him his change, but he didn't take it. Instead, he slid it into the tip jar, his eyes never leaving hers. As he took his coffee and pastry to a table by the window, Nora found herself watching him. He wasn't like the usual tourists. He didn't scroll through his phone or snap pictures of his drink. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, watching the ocean through the window as if he wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere. Lily nudged her. "You've been staring at him for a solid minute." Nora rolled her eyes. "I have not." "You so have, and I don't blame you." "That man is gorgeous." "He's a tourist," Nora reminded her. "He'll be gone in a few days." Lily shrugged. "Maybe, but he seems interested in more than just coffee." Nora didn't answer. She refused to let herself believe that. But when Preston returned the next morning, and the morning after that, she started to wonder if just maybe he wasn't like the others. Nora hadn't expected Preston to keep coming back. Most tourists drifted in and out of the cafe once, maybe twice, before vanishing like footprints in the sand. But Preston, he had become a fixture in her mornings. Each day, he claimed the same spot by the window, where the golden morning light caught the sharp angles of his face. He always ordered the strongest coffee on the menu, never added sugar, and occasionally let her surprise him with a pastry. But more than that, he had a way of pulling her into conversation, teasing out details about her life, her favorite places in town, the things she wanted to do beyond Cape Haven. And somehow she found herself answering. "I feel like I should start a tally," she said one morning as she handed him his coffee. "You've been here, 5 days in a row now?" Preston accepted the cup, his fingers brushing against hers just briefly. 6, he corrected. "You missed a day." Nora tilted her head. "You're keeping track." "I have a good memory." His eyes held something unreadable, something that made her pulse skip in a way she wasn't ready to name. She scoffed, leaning against the counter. "You must really like the coffee." "It's not the coffee that keeps me coming back." Her breath hitched at his words, but before she could press him on it, a group of customers walked in, pulling her attention away. When she finally looked back, Preston was already settled at his usual table, sipping his drink like he hadn't just said something that sent warmth curling through her stomach. Lily nudged her as she passed. You're smiling. No, I'm not. You so are. Nora rolled her eyes and focused on work, but the truth was undeniable. Preston was getting under her skin. A few days later, the café was winding down for the evening when Preston walked in, surprising her. She was used to seeing him in the mornings, not at closing time. Didn't think you were a night coffee drinker, she said as she wiped down the counter. Maybe I wanted to see what this place is like when it's quiet, he said, sliding onto a stool. She arched an eyebrow. Or maybe you wanted to see me. His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. Maybe. Her fingers stilled against the rag she was holding. She wasn't used to this, the way he looked at her, like he saw past the surface. The way he spoke to her, like he actually cared about her answers. She cleared her throat. Well, if you're here for coffee, you're out of luck. I already shut the machines down for the night. Then I guess I'll have to settle for conversation. She hesitated. It would have been easy to brush him off, to remind herself that he had an expiration date, that in a matter of days or weeks, he'd be gone like every other tourist. But for some reason, she didn't want to push him away, so she set the rag aside and leaned on the counter. All right, mystery man. What do you want to know? He tilted his head. What's the best place in town that tourists never find? She considered the question. There's a spot on the cliffs, she said finally. Not the main overlook, but farther down the trail. Hardly anyone goes there, but the view is incredible. You can see the whole ocean stretch out in front of you, nothing but endless blue. His lips curved slightly. Sounds like the perfect place to escape, she shrugged. I guess it's quiet, peaceful. Have you ever taken anyone there? She shook her head. No. It's kind of my place. Preston studied her for a moment. Would you take me? A sudden nervousness fluttered in her stomach. Why would I do that? Because I think you want to, he said simply. And the worst part, he was right. The next evening, just as the sun dipped low over the ocean, she found herself leading him up the narrow trail that wound along the cliffs. The salty air was crisp, the sky streaked with gold and violet. You weren't kidding, Preston said as they reached the edge. This is incredible. Nora hugged her arms to her chest. Told you, he glanced at her. Why haven't you left this town? The question caught her off guard. What? You talk about places you want to see, things you want to do, so why are you still here? She exhaled slowly. It's complicated. Try me. She hesitated, then finally admitted, my mom left when I was little, my dad. He did his best, but it was just the two of us, and now it's just me. This place, this cafe, it's all I've ever known. Preston was quiet for a long moment. That's a lot to carry on your own. She forced a small smile. I manage. I don't doubt that. His voice was soft, but there was something else there, something she couldn't quite name. They stood in silence for a while, just watching the waves crash against the shore below. Then, out of nowhere, he said, I leave soon. Something in her chest tightened. She knew this was temporary. She had told herself that over and over again. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel real in a way she wasn't ready for. She swallowed hard. When? A few days. She nodded, forcing her expression to remain neutral. Makes sense, you're a city guy. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, yeah. She didn't ask where he was going, she didn't want to know. Because no matter what, one thing was clear, Preston wasn't just another tourist, and that terrified her. The waves crashed against the cliffs below, their rhythmic roar filling the silence between them. Preston stood beside Nora, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The air between them felt heavier now, charged with something unspoken. You must have a whole life waiting for you, Nora said, her voice carefully even. Wherever it is you're going. Preston didn't answer right away. He shifted slightly, glancing at her as if weighing his words before saying them aloud. Something like that, she exhaled, nodding. Makes sense. A pause stretched between them, delicate and uncertain. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. Would you ever leave this place? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? If you had the chance, if nothing was holding you back, would you go? Nora hesitated. The thought of leaving Cape Haven had crossed her mind before, but it had always been a fleeting dream, something too fragile to hold on to. I don't know, she admitted. It's hard to imagine. Preston studied her for a moment. I think you could, she scoffed lightly. It's not that simple. Maybe not, he conceded, but I think you want more than this town. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. Instead, she turned back to the ocean, watching the endless expanse of water stretch beyond the horizon. Preston shifted closer, just enough that she could feel his presence beside her. "I'm leaving in 2 days." Nora's stomach tightened, though she had known this was coming. "Right," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Where to?" His jaw tensed slightly. "New York. A city of glass and steel, a world so far removed from the quiet charm of Cape Haven, it might as well have been another universe." "Figures," she said, forcing a small laugh. "You have that big city look about you." He didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head, watching her carefully. "Come with me." Her heart stumbled over a beat. "What?" "To New York," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Just for a little while, see something new." She shook her head, a disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. "You're crazy." "Maybe," he admitted, "but I mean it." "You don't even know me," she argued. "I know enough," he countered. "I know you want more than this. I know you feel stuck here, even if you won't admit it. And I know I don't want this to be the last time I see you." Nora's pulse hammered against her ribs. This was impossible, insane, and yet, for a fleeting moment, she imagined it. The towering buildings, the dazzling lights, the rush of a city that never slept. Standing beside Preston in a world that wasn't hers but could be, just for a little while, but reality settled in just as quickly. "I can't just leave." "Why not?" she swallowed. "Because this is my life. The cafe, this town, it's all I've ever known." "That doesn't mean it's all you ever have to know." She turned to him, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You don't get it. You're just passing through. You have a whole life somewhere else. I don't have that luxury." Preston's expression darkened, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You think this is just about passing through? What else would it be?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I wasn't planning to tell you this." Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. "Tell me what?" He hesitated for half a second, then finally met her gaze. "I own one of the largest investment firms in New York." The words landed like a sudden storm, knocking the air from her lungs. She blinked. "What?" "I run a company," he said evenly. "A big one." Nora's mouth went dry. "You're a millionaire," he finished. "Yeah," she let out a sharp breath. "You're joking." "I'm not." She stared at him, searching for any sign that this was some elaborate prank, but his face remained serious. She swallowed. "You've been sitting in my cafe every morning, drinking $2 coffee, and you could, buy the whole place if you wanted to." "That's not why I was there," he said firmly, "and I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to change anything." Nora felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. "So you let me believe." She trailed off, shaking her head. "You don't belong here." "Neither do you," he said quietly, her breath hitched. She turned away, staring at the ocean as if it could anchor her. This was too much, too fast. "You should go," she said finally. Preston's jaw tightened. "Nora, I mean it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just go." A long silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And Nora was left standing on the cliffs, the waves crashing below, wondering why it suddenly felt so much quieter without him there. The cafe felt different without him. Nora tried to ignore it, tried to go about her usual routine, but there was an undeniable emptiness in the seat by the window. It had only been a few days, but somehow Preston had carved out a space in her world. Now, with him gone, it was as if the air itself felt heavier. She hated how much she noticed. Lily caught her staring at the empty table more than once. "You're miserable," she observed one afternoon, arms crossed as she leaned against the counter. "And before you deny it, that sigh you just let out, that was the sigh of a woman pining." Nora scowled. "I am not pining." "Right," Lily tilted her head. "That's why you've been wiping that counter for the past 3 minutes even though it's already clean." Nora glanced down at the rag in her hand and groaned, tossing it aside. "Fine, I miss him. Happy." Lily gave a knowing nod. "So why don't you do something about it?" "Like what?" "Drop everything and chase after him." "Why not?" Nora threw her hands up. "Because that's insane," Lily shrugged. "So was him asking you to go with him, but you didn't say no because you didn't want to go. You said no because you were scared." Nora opened her mouth to argue, but the words never came, because deep down she knew Lily was right. She had been scared, still was. But now, with Preston gone, all she could think about was how much she had let slip through her fingers. The cafe door opened and her heart leapt before she could stop herself. But it wasn't him. It never was. Nora turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as frustration built inside her. She had spent so much of her life convinced that her world had to stay small, that she had to stay in Cape Haven because it was safe, because it was familiar. But Preston had made her feel something she hadn't in a long time possibility, and she had let it walk away. Lily's voice broke through her thoughts. You know, if you don't do something soon, you're going to regret it. Regret. The word settled deep in her chest, and suddenly, Nora knew she couldn't let that happen. She wasn't the kind of person who did reckless things. She wasn't the kind of person who took risks, but Preston had changed something inside her. And maybe, just maybe, it was time she did something about it. New York was nothing like Cape Haven. The streets pulsed with energy, skyscrapers towering overhead, the sounds of honking taxis and hurried footsteps filling the air. It was overwhelming, chaotic, and completely different from anything Nora had ever known. And yet, she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about him. Standing outside the gleaming glass building that housed Preston's company, she felt her nerves creep in. What if he didn't want to see her? What if she had been too late? But she had come this far. She wasn't going to turn back now. Taking a steadying breath, she stepped inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, all polished marble and towering windows that overlooked the city. A receptionist greeted her, professionally polite but slightly skeptical as Nora hesitated. "I'm here to see Preston," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The receptionist glanced at her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" Nora swallowed hard. "No, but can you just tell him Nora is here?" There was a brief pause before the receptionist picked up the phone, murmuring into it. Seconds stretched into eternity. "Then you can go up," the woman said, nodding toward the elevators. Nora's pulse pounded as she stepped inside, watching the numbers climb higher and higher. When the doors slid open, she was met with an office that was nothing like the cozy warmth of the cafe. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, and the space was sleek and pristine, a world of power and precision. And standing near the window, looking as effortlessly composed as ever, was Preston. He turned at the sound of the elevator, and the moment his eyes landed on her, something shifted. "Nora," she swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "Hi." For a moment, neither of them moved, then he strode toward her, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Her heart was a mess of emotions, but she pushed forward. "I should have said yes." Preston's eyes darkened. "To what?" "To you," she said, voice strong. "To leaving, to taking a chance." Something flickered in his expression, something raw and real. "I was scared," she admitted. "But I don't want to be any more." Preston exhaled, his hands going to his hips as if trying to steady himself. "Nora, do you know how many times I almost went back?" Her breath caught. "I told myself you made your choice, that I had no right to push," he said, "but I wanted to." Her chest ached at the thought of him feeling the same longing she had. "I don't know if this is crazy," she continued. "But I know that I don't want to spend another day wondering what if." Preston stepped closer, and when he spoke, his voice was softer but no less intense. "Are you saying you're here to stay?" Nora hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know, but I'm here now." Preston studied her for a long moment, then, without another word, he reached for her, pulling her against him. And when his lips met hers, it wasn't hurried or unsure. It was a kiss that spoke of time lost, of choices made, of something that had been waiting to happen. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "You have no idea how much I wanted this," she smiled, breathless. "I think I do." And as she stood there, wrapped in his arms, the city stretching out around them, she realized something. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready for it. With him. Preston's arms remained around Nora, the hum of the city below them barely registering as they stood together in his office. He looked at her as if he was trying to memorize every inch of her face, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "You just left Cape Haven." His voice was quiet but filled with something deeper. She nodded, her fingers curling slightly against the crisp fabric of his shirt. "I did." A slow breath left Preston as if he was absorbing the weight of those words. "You're really here." "I am." A flicker of emotion crossed his face before he reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Come with me." He didn't wait for her to answer. Instead, he led her through the office, past the sleek glass walls and polished floors, past curious glances from employees who had never seen their powerful boss lead someone through the building with such urgency. They stepped into the elevator, and for a moment, it was just the two of them again, the city stretching out in every direction beyond the glass walls. "I have to ask," she said, her voice softer now. "In Cape Haven, you never acted like a man who owns all this," Preston finished, his mouth quirking slightly. She tilted her head, studying him. "Yeah," his grip on her hand tightened slightly before he answered, "because I didn't want that to be what you saw first." Nora let that sink in. She had spent so much time thinking he was just another tourist, someone passing through, never realizing the weight of the world he carried on his shoulders. The elevator doors opened, and before she could ask where they were going, Preston guided her into a black luxury sedan waiting outside the building. The driver barely reacted, as if used to his boss making sudden changes to his schedule. Within moments, they were weaving through the streets of Manhattan, the towering skyline shifting around them with every turn. "Where are we going?" Nora finally asked. Preston turned his head toward her, his blue eyes steady. "To show you what it would be like if you stayed." Her heart gave an uneven beat. The car eventually pulled into an underground garage, and Preston led her into a private elevator. When the doors slid open, she was met with a penthouse that was nothing short of breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, the city lights glittering like stars. The open layout was sleek but warm, with deep leather furniture and subtle gold accents. A fireplace flickered in the corner, casting a soft glow over the room. Nora stepped inside, taking it all in. "This is where you live." Preston stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "It is now. For a long time, I barely spent time here." She turned to him. "Why?" His gaze flickered with something unreadable before he answered. "Because I thought success would be enough. That building my company, having this life, would make everything feel whole." She waited, sensing there was more. "But it never did," he admitted. "I kept moving, kept pushing forward, but it all felt temporary. Like something was always missing." Nora's breath caught slightly, but she stayed silent, letting him speak. "Then I went to Cape Haven," he continued. "And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just the man running a company. I was just me." Her chest tightened. "I don't want you to think I'm asking you to stay because it's convenient for me," Preston said, stepping closer. "I'm asking because I don't want to go back to the way things were before I met you." The honesty in his voice made it impossible to look away. "I don't expect you to have all the answers right now," he added. "But I want you to know that if you choose this, if you choose me, I won't let you regret it." Nora exhaled slowly, her emotions a tangled mess of uncertainty and something dangerously close to hope. She had spent so long believing her world had to be small, that leaving Cape Haven meant losing a part of herself. But standing here in front of him, she realized something. It wasn't about leaving behind what she knew, it was about stepping towards something new. And maybe, just maybe, Preston had become part of that. Instead of answering, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held every unspoken word between them. He responded instantly, his hands cradling her face, his touch steady and sure. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. Nora took a deep breath, then nodded, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The following days passed in a blur of city lights and quiet moments, each one drawing Preston and Nora closer in ways neither of them had anticipated. He showed her his world, not the polished boardrooms or the relentless pace of high-powered meetings, but the parts of his life that truly mattered. Late-night walks through Central Park, quiet dinners in hidden restaurants where no one whispered his name, and stolen mornings where they sat on his penthouse balcony, watching the sun rise over a city that never slept. Nora had expected to feel lost here, swallowed whole by the sheer enormity of it all. But with him, she found herself fitting into this life in ways she hadn't thought possible. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop of his building, the city stretching endlessly beneath them, Preston turned to her with a quiet intensity. "You don't have to stay, you know," he said. "I meant what I said before. I don't want you to feel like this is something you have to do." Nora met his gaze, the warmth of the moment wrapping around her. "I know," he exhaled, nodding slightly. But I want to be here," she said. "I want to see what this could be." Something shifted in his expression, something raw and real. He reached for her then, his fingers threading through hers, and pulled her into his arms. "You have no idea what it means to hear that," he murmured. That night, as the city glowed around them, Nora realized she had never been more certain of anything in her life. Weeks turned into months, and somehow, she and Preston built something that felt solid, unshakable. The café in Cape Haven had become a memory one she cherished, but no longer felt tethered to. She had found work at a small gallery downtown, a place where she could lose herself in creativity, surrounded by art and people who spoke about the world in colors and textures rather than numbers and deadlines. And Preston, he had changed too. She saw it in the way he no longer buried himself in endless work, in the way he made time not just for her, but for himself. He still ran his company with the same sharp precision, but now there was balance. Now there was something more. One evening, after a particularly long day, he came home to find her curled up on the couch, a book resting against her lap. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching her with that quiet intensity that always made her heart race. "Something on your mind?" she asked, setting the book aside. He crossed the room slowly, lowering himself onto the couch beside her. "Yeah," he admitted. "You." A soft laugh escaped her. "That's not new." "No," he agreed. "But this is." He reached into his pocket, and before she could fully process what was happening, he was holding a small velvet box between them. Nora stared at it, her breath catching. Preston exhaled, his expression steady but filled with something deeper. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who did this. At least, not like this. But then you walked into my life, and suddenly, everything I thought I knew didn't matter anymore." She swallowed hard, her pulse pounding. "I love you," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I don't want a life that doesn't have you in it. So, Nora Grayson, will you marry me?" Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she barely noticed. All she could see was him, the man who had walked into her café and changed everything. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, stronger. "Yes." Relief and something dangerously close to joy flashed across his face before he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never intended to let go. Their wedding was small but perfect. Held on a secluded rooftop garden, surrounded by the closest people in their lives, it was intimate and filled with the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures to be felt. Preston had never looked at anyone the way he looked at her when she walked toward him, the city skyline framing them like a moment frozen in time. And when he said his vows, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only the unwavering certainty that she was it for him. And she felt the same. When they kissed, when the applause rang out around them, when they turned to face the world as husband and wife, Nora knew she had made the right choice, not just in leaving Cape Haven, but in choosing him. Years later, as they stood on the balcony of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Preston wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. She turned to him, smiling softly. "Not for a second." And as they stood there, the city stretching out before them, their future unwritten but filled with endless possibility, she knew one thing for certain: she had found exactly where she was meant to be. With him.